o'clock exam. Make sure you're here and ready to go. But more details on the final, and I'll start putting the final exam study guide together as well here. So. Okay, so that's just a couple of announcements there. Any questions? Any more questions about any of that? No. Okay, then where are we today? Last time we were here, we took a look at a film, beginning of a film. We finished up the Korean War, and then we took a look at a film over the early civil rights movement. It's a large series called Eyes on the Prize, and this particular episode was about the murder of Emmett Till, this 14-year-old kid from Chicago who went down to the South, did not understand white Southern or segregation customs in the white South, and was brutally murdered because of that. All right? I had shown that video primarily because I was losing my voice and was not really able to talk much more than what I did that day. That situation has not changed much, unfortunately. I wanted to talk a little bit about the early civil rights movement before the Emmett Till murder, which I'm going to do that now. And then we're going to take a look at the second half of that film, the Montgomery bus boycott, where we meet Martin Luther King Jr. for the first time. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. And then if we have time, this is taking a little longer than I thought, but if we have time, at least start to take a look at the incident in Little Rock, Arkansas, 1957 and 58. So that's kind of the schedule for today. And then on Thursday, we'll either wrap that up, at least as far as we can, on Thursday, and then we'll come back to Eisenhower, a little bit of the Cold War continuation, and begin maybe a discussion, at least the early stages of the Vietnam War. Okay, so that's kind of our schedule for this week. And then next week we'll get as far as we can into the later 20th century, Nixon, Carter, and Reagan, as far as we can get. Okay? All right, so that's kind of our schedule here for the next couple of days. Now, I'm backing up here just a little bit. This is what I had wanted to talk about before we saw the film on Emmett Till. We're going to talk about it now, and then we'll put the Emmett Till murder in a context. Okay? So the early civil rights movement, the early civil rights movement actually begins in earnest during World War II. Okay? But before World War II, I want to just sort of introduce to you some streams of thought here in the African American community about how to deal with racism, racial discrimination, and obviously, most importantly, segregation in the South. Right? So remember that we have a Supreme Court case in 1896, so the end of the 19th century, Plessy v. Ferguson. Right? I think I mentioned that last time, but this was a Supreme Court case which basically said that segregation was allowable under the Constitution. Right? It was constitutionally acceptable to separate people based on race, as long as you provided equal services. Right? That's where the phrase separate but equal comes from. And as we know, it is always separate and it is never equal. Okay? So, Plessy v. Ferguson, this gave the constitutionality to the policy of segregation. All right. Now, two important leaders we want to consider here. Again, this is Booker T. Washington in the late 19th century, sort of post-Reconstruction. He was important because he stressed he stressed a particular idea that we refer to as accommodation. Okay, that was what he said. Is look, there's a lot of racism in the United States or in the world, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. People are racists. Okay. So instead of banging your head against the wall trying to fight against that, the way to actually go about it is more of a long-term plan in which you try to learn skills through education to where you can obviously get a job and support yourself, and in sort of building an educational base. And when I talk about education, I'm talking about sort of vo-tech, right? That is, not necessarily, college and not necessarily, higher education, but skills and training that obviously would make African Americans employable. And therefore, what you're doing slowly is you're becoming a force in the economy, an economic force, right? And long term, what he's saying here is that it is going to be the economic pressure of the African American community that will slowly but surely force the racism. Again, trying to convince somebody to not be a racist is almost impossible, right? But what you can begin to do is have the economic pressure to begin to demand changes. But you got to build that economic pressure, and that means education, that means training, that means jobs, right? So what he really did was he went around and started a whole bunch of schools, right? Most importantly is the Tuskegee Institute, right? And many schools like that in the South, trying to provide training and education for African Americans, right? But what he is basically saying here is there's nothing you can do about racism, so don't fight against it. Try to improve your situation through economic change. Okay? So what he's saying there is just that this is where the phrase accommodation. He's willing to accommodate the racism of the white South, or again, not just the white South, but racism in general. Right? It exists. There's not a whole lot you can do to change it. Don't waste your time fighting against that. Make a difference through economic change. Okay? Now, if he's going to take this particular perspective, and he was hugely influential in the South, how do you think somebody like this is going to be viewed, particularly by whites? That is, he's willing to accommodate racism.
Dangerous.
He's what?
He's dangerous.
He's dangerous. Why do you say that?
To the whites, to the racists. Because they would constitute that as rebellion.
But what he... There is that element for sure, but I guess what I would suggest to you is this guy is not dangerous at all compared to this guy, right? So Booker T. Washington actually becomes, how do we say this? Because he's willing to accommodate racism and not fight against it, he's actually going to be seen not so much as dangerous, but as sort of passive, right? Which means that white people are quite happy to donate money to his institutions around the South, his schools, and it makes him very successful, and it makes obviously these schools successful. But he is ultimately really not trying to challenge the system. He's willing to accommodate the system, right? So this is late 19th century Booker T. Washington. This is post-Reconstruction, because he was kind of seen as passive when it came to fighting against the racism. He's not going to be seen as threatening nearly as much as somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Du Bois comes a little bit later, right? Late 19th, early 20th century. But Du Bois, first of all, he absolutely disagreed with this idea of accommodation. He's much more assertive, much more aggressive, demanding that the federal government enforce the Constitution, 15th Amendment, the right to vote, equal rights, 14th Amendment, citizenship, equal protection under the law. And he was the one who said, I might have mentioned this phrase in the aftermath of Reconstruction, that while yes, it outlawed slavery, and yes, we put forth constitutional amendments like citizenship at the national level, and as citizens you're entitled to equal protection under the law, and eliminating racial discrimination as a means to be able to vote. So there was a lot of success, but most of that is not going to be enforced. So he referred to Reconstruction as a, quote, splendid failure, right? There were good things, but ultimately it was a failure because there was not the will of the federal government to enforce this legislation, this constitutional amendment. But from a perspective of, Booker T. Washington on one hand, accommodating racism, don't be aggressive, don't be assertive, try to get jobs, educate yourself, and slowly, bring about change through economic pressure. Here comes by the way, he's the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. He is from the elite African American segment of society. He's from the upper class. And unfortunately, he tended to focus on the elites within the African American community, right? Booker T. Washington tended to focus on sort of the lower middle class, right? Again, slightly educated or at least skilled African Americans. And so notice that they kind of focus on different segments of the African American population, community, right? But Du Bois is very aggressive in his demands that we don't accommodate racism, that we challenge it, that we fight against it, right? And as a result, he is going to be much more threatening or dangerous, as you say, relative to somebody like Washington, right? Now, all I'm trying to suggest to you there is that African American community is not a monolithic community. It has lots of different perspectives and ways to deal with these problems, right? You have Washington, who is more into accommodation. You have Du Bois, who is much more into assertion and aggressively demanding that the federal government enforce the law, right? Now, these two are very important. They're kind of in opposition to each other, but they represent sort of perspectives on how to deal with this racial discrimination in the United States, right? Question?
Basically, they're same sides of the same coin.
The goal is still the same, to
Right.
challenge racial discrimination.
But that also transfers over into Martin Luther King and Malcolm X.
What do you mean transfers over?
I mean, Martin Luther King.
Different perspectives of the same
Right.
goal? Absolutely. King is going to be much more, not so much accommodation, but he's passive,
And Malcolm
nonviolent,
X is more radical.
much more radical, much more aggressive. Absolutely. That's the later civil rights movement. Absolutely correct, right? So these are sort of the predecessors of that dichotomy between Malcolm X and King, who we'll talk about a little bit on Thursday or the following week when we get a little bit further into the 20th century. All right? Now, I'm just sort of presenting both of these two guys as leaders within the African American community prior to World War II. Prior to World War II. Okay? It's during World War II. And by the way, I did post a handout. I know I was kind of late in getting it, but I did post a handout that has all of this stuff on there in the WebCT, so you can check that out. Civil rights movement, as a sort of an organized effort to challenge racial discrimination, really begins in World War II. Right? Now, I would argue that it was the murder of Emmett Till that was that spark that really got it going, right? But as far as a sort of tactic, a strategy, we start to see it in World War II. And A. Philip Randolph was one of the major leaders of the civil rights movement during World War II. Now, remember, this is a time, Franklin Roosevelt as president is dependent upon white Southern votes, right? That was the power base of the Democratic Party for the last half century or so. It is also Roosevelt, in his willingness to help as many people as possible during the Great Depression, that, and again, things like social welfare, things like Social Security, distribution aid, putting people to work, public works projects, all of this sort of stuff in an attempt to kind of help alleviate some of the suffering as well as get the country out of the Depression. This is where the sort of change begins to shift here to where there was this political realignment, as we talked about, and African Americans overwhelmingly begin to vote Democratic during the late 1930s and early 40s because of Roosevelt's efforts, right? But the problem is, of course, that Roosevelt is still dependent politically for votes in the white South, which means that his attitude is sort of mixed when it comes to race, right? He is still somewhat willing to condone a lot of the racism of the white South for political expediency to get the votes of the white Southern voter. Right? And this is where the African American community, led by Randolph, among others, began to organize in an efficient manner for the first time. Right? But notice that it's because of the war that you start to have a little leverage. Right? Remember what we talked about with Stalin in Eastern Europe, right? You negotiate during the war when it's necessary, because after the war, the Soviets are no longer going to be important to the United States perspective, right? So that's the same sort of situation here. If Franklin Roosevelt wants the support of the African American community during the war, then this is the time to demand concessions, right? During World War I, African Americans had generally followed a path of accommodation similar to what Washington had said. And as a result, or what was the result of that? No change. No change, right? Remember, the 1920s, after World War I, was some of the worst racial violence and racial tensions in all of U.S. history after the Civil War, right? So Randolph is going to take this opportunity when he has a little leverage here to demand concessions. And it is Randolph that called for the first massive organized march on Washington, D.C., right? So we talk about King and Martin Luther King and the I Have a Dream speech in 1963 and this massive demonstration. Where did he get an idea like that? He got it from Randolph, right, 20 years earlier, okay, in the 40s. This is the summer of 1941. right? As we are about to enter into World War II. Now, what is the main purpose of this march? It was to protest specifically racial discrimination in the hiring practices of the defense industry, so military contractors, factories, etc., building weapons, manufacturing war materials, was obviously guilty of racial discrimination in their hiring practices. This is also, of course, a time where the United States military was 100% segregated. Segregated. African Americans and white soldiers do not fight next to each other. It gets so bad that during World War II, African American nurses are not even allowed to treat wounded white soldiers, and vice versa. It actually gets so bad that they segregated the blood supply. Apparently there's a difference between white red blood and black red blood. I don't know. But they segregated the blood supply. That's how entrenched this idea of, again, of segregation and racism was in the United States military. So Randolph is protesting racial discrimination in the hiring practice of the defense industry and the segregated military, right? And what does Roosevelt want? Well, Roosevelt just wants all this to go away, right? He wants to deal with the war and not have to deal with this issue. And again, that's the point. That's when you demand concessions, when you have the most leverage, all right? So when it comes to this march, how was it different? How was it organized? How was it set up? All right? Well, first of all, this is the first time that we see in a concerted effort this effort to organize and mobilize the masses of the African American community. All right? All African Americans. Second of all, what we're talking about here is a policy of, again, the objective is to end racial discrimination. Right? How do you do that? Well, you do it a number of different ways. You can do it through something like passive resistance. Passive resistance would be something like Mamie Till leaving the casket of her son's, Emmett Till, in the funeral, leaving the casket open. Now, again, this is where people walking by see it, right? And again, she said so they could see what they did to her son, right? That's a form of passive resistance, right? You're demonstrating, you're showing this violence, this discrimination, these problems, but you're not really sort of out in the way, right? People had to come to the funeral to see it. A march is where you get in the way, right? And that's what direct action is, getting in the way, right? So this is where you're going to, again, march, protest, be visible, clog up the streets, and this is what we mean by direct action, okay? So this is where you demand concessions through direct action. This march was an example of that. He also, A. Philip Randolph also began to organize in an interesting way, or unite. Prior to this time, the African American community was oftentimes divided between North and South, between rural blacks in the South, largely predominantly agricultural workers, and urban Northern blacks, obviously, in factory jobs, right? And there was a kind of a disconnect between these two groups of people, and this is the first time to really unite them in a united effort, right? And then finally, he took a very interesting perspective. He actually, in an effort to get rid of segregation, segregated his own march. He excluded whites from it, right? Now, the purpose behind that was, he said very famously that it is the Negro that suffers from Jim Crow. It must be the Negro that overturns Jim Crow. Jim Crow is another term for the segregation policies of the white South, right? So, again, what happens here so often is that if a bunch of, liberal white Northerners come down and get involved in this, and there's success, who ends up getting credit for that? A lot of times it's the whites, because they're the influential people, right? So the point was, he's trying to make sure that when this is all said and done, who is actually going to be involved in it, who is responsible for overturning it, for challenging it, and ultimately gets the credit for it, it's going to be the black community itself, right? So again, in many ways, this was a unique way to organize this demonstration, this protest, this march. And it was the first one that we'd ever seen. Now, to be very clear about that, this was proposed to Roosevelt that this is what's going to happen if Roosevelt does not give in. Well, as I said, Roosevelt just wants this whole issue to go away so he can focus on the war. So Roosevelt gave in. He gave in. He gave concessions, right? And I don't remember if I have this or not. No, I didn't. Oh, hold on. I meant to include this slide here. Oh, shoot. Okay, here's what it's called. I know you guys don't have this handout here, but this is what Roosevelt did. Through executive order, he created a new agency. And the initials are FEPC. FEPC. That stands for the Fair Employment Practice Committee. FEPC. Fair Employment Practice Committee. The FEPC. Roosevelt created this agency to investigate allegations of racial discrimination in the hiring practices of the defense industry. So Roosevelt gave in to the demands, right, concessions of Randolph by creating this government agency to investigate allegations of racial discrimination in the hiring practices of the defense industry. Now, when it came to the desegregating the military, Roosevelt would not budge on that. He's not going to even consider that. All right. And again, the thinking at the time was still very much a racist way of thinking, is that in a time of war, the military is no place for a social experiment. Right. We're not going to mess with that now. Maybe later, but not now. Okay. So he gave in to the protests about racial discrimination and hiring practices in the defense industry, but he would not budge. Roosevelt would not budge when it came to the desegregating the military. All right. Now, in response, because Roosevelt gave in, have any of you ever seen this pictures of this march? No, because it never took place. The whole march was called off because Roosevelt gave in, right? That is the point here, is that, and this is why we say the civil rights movement begins during World War II, because what was the lesson that was just learned? Through organized, disciplined, thoughtful use of direct action, real concessions were granted for the first time in a meaningful way. And that is the lesson, as well as the strategy and tactics that future leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. will implement in challenging other aspects of segregation and racial discrimination. Right? Thoughtful, disciplined, organized, direct action led to real concessions. Right? Not everything that they wanted, but some of the things they wanted. All right? The Fair Employment Practice Committee, the FEPC as it's known, was created by Roosevelt in the hopes that this march would not take place. Because again, Roosevelt is trying to focus on the war, does not want to deal with this. He gave in, right? But that was the lesson that was learned. Demand concessions. Demand concessions, right? Okay, now, two other organizations, two other groups we should consider here. One it's referred to as CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. And this will actually be founded during the war itself, 1942. Founded by a man named Joseph Farmer. Right? And we'll see Farmer, I think, a little bit later in another film clip here. But what's interesting about the Congress of Racial Equality was its tactics. Right? Its tactics, its strategies. They were pacifists. They heavily emphasized the use of nonviolence. Nonviolence. Right? They will implement practices called sit-ins. And we'll see an example of a sit-in. But a sit-in is direct action, right? You literally go sit down at a lunch counter until you are arrested. Go sit down in a mayor's office until you are arrested. And when you are arrested and taken away, somebody else goes and sits down behind you, right? And the whole point is to clog up the jails to such a degree that they no longer can arrest you, right? Again, it is getting in the way. That's what direct action is all about. But it must be nonviolent. That's what CORE was all about, right? And this is heavily going to influence Martin Luther King Jr., right? When he will begin a program, a policy of nonviolent direct action. Okay? The other group that probably you're more familiar with, still, both these groups are still around today, but the one that gets a little more attention, of course, is the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This is an older organization founded in the early 20th century in 1909. W.B. Du Bois was part of the founding of this and was a leader of the NAACP as of 1910. Now, this particular organization tended to emphasize court cases, right? To use the courts. So when we talk about, for example, Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, who was what organization was instrumental in bringing that lawsuit to the Supreme Court? The NAACP. So the point here is that the NAACP, their great success was actually using the courts to emphasize, to demonstrate, to prove racial discrimination throughout the United States, not just in the South, but primarily in the South. Okay? The problem, of course, is, and this is why I say that 1954 is the Brown decision, Brown versus Board of Education. It overturned segregation in public schools, so it directly challenged Plessy v. Ferguson and this idea that segregation was constitutional. The Brown decision overturns that. But again, the point is it overturned it only in public schools. But here's the point. Once you have that precedent set, our court system is based on precedent, right? Past decisions influence future decisions. If it's unconstitutional in public schools, segregation, then it's very easy to make the case that it's unconstitutional in lunch counters, in restaurants, on city buses, on state buses. And the point is, that's why the Brown decision is so important. It's going to take other court cases to overturn other aspects of segregation, but the 54 Brown decision is that most important one because it's the first time segregation is declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. All right? That was 1954. 1955 is the murder of Emmett Till. Okay? Now, I want to then pick up the story from that point forward, 1955, with the Montgomery bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. And we're going to take a look at a couple of clips here. This will be the one on Montgomery. I don't know if we'll have time today. I'm hoping that we can get it in. We'll also want to consider what happens in 57 and 58 with Little Rock, Arkansas. Okay? Now, what I've done is, I know it's kind of difficult to take notes from the film. So on the handout that I posted in WebCT, I kind of have the major points from the film clips that we're going to take a look at. I have the one from Emmett Till on there, so if you weren't here and you didn't get to see that, the major points are there. Again, you can, because this is all recorded, and I did update the podcast, at least through the last time, you can at least hear the dialogue of the film as well, so that if you did miss it, you can at least go back and get a sense of what was going on there. I don't know how well the visual quality works on that or not. But I want to pick this up with the next major incident here, 1955 into 56, the Montgomery bus boycott. So let me shift gears here just a little bit.
Lynchings in Mississippi alone.
This was the end of the Emmett Till situation we saw last time. I'll get the lights here in just a second.
The fact that Emmett Till, a young black man, could be found floating down the river in Mississippi, as indeed many had been done over the years, just set in concrete the determination of people to move forward. And I think we said back there that really only God, only the books in heaven can know how many Negroes have come up missing and dead and killed under the system in which we live.
In Mississippi, A few black people stood up to the system, but it was not enough. Their challenge was easily beaten back. 3 months later in Alabama, when many stood together, the challenge would be strong. It started with a woman named Rosa Parks in Montgomery.
Montgomery in 1955 was a typical southern city. We are called the cradle of the Confederacy. And there is a tradition in Montgomery of having carrying out the old Confederate South type of things, the stars and bars, flags. It was a totally segregated community. Department stores that had white water fountains and colored water fountains. We had separate taxis. You had black taxis and you had white taxis.
And Montgomery, like all of the South, had segregated buses. In interstate buses like this one, and in city buses, the whites sat in the front, the blacks in back. If more whites got on, the blacks had to give them the middle and back seats too. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger.
The front seats were occupied, and with one man, a white man, standing. And then at this point, the driver asked us to stand up and let him have those seats. And when none of us moved at his first words, he said, "Y'all make it light on yourselves and let me have those seats." And when the policeman approached me, one of them spoke and asked me if the driver had asked me to stand. I said, yes. He said, "Why don't you stand up?" I said, "I don't think I should have to stand up." And I asked him, I said, "Why did he push us around?" He said, "I do not know, but the law is the law and you're under arrest."
Mrs. Parks was formerly my secretary in the NAACP in the local branch for about 12 years. She also worked with me when I was state president of the NAACP. And she also assisted me in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And if there ever was a woman who was dedicated to the cause, Rosa Parks was that woman.
This was not the first time a black person had defied the bus segregation in Montgomery. It was not Mrs. Parks' first time. It was her first arrest. Edie Nixon went to the police station to bail her out.
I said, "Miss Parks," I said, "with your permission, we can break down segregation on the bus with your case." I said, I'm convinced that we can do it. I said, if Addie wasn't convinced, I wasn't bothered by it. She asked her mother what she thought about it. She said, "I'll go along with Mr. Nixon." I asked her husband, he said, "I'll support it." So that's fine.
Edie Nixon and other black leaders called for a one-day bus boycott. In some cities, it would have been impossible to organize 40,000 people in 2 days. But Black Montgomery had a core of activists in the Women's Political Council, and they distributed these boycott notices all over the city.
I called every person who was in every school and every place where we had planned to be at that, have somebody at that school or wherever it was at a certain time, that I would be there with materials for them to disseminate. I didn't go to bed that night. I cut those stencils. I ran off 35,000 copies.
But the bus passed right down in front of my house, And I got up to see it, and several buses passed. I was late for work because I was trying to see how many buses was empty, and they were totally empty.
The one-day boycott was a success. That night, a mobilized black community turned out for a meeting at the Holt Street Baptist Church and voted unanimously to continue the boycott.
The preachers were preaching as I came in. I was about 2 minutes late coming in, and they were preaching. And that audience was so on fire that the preacher would get up and say, "You want your freedom?" And they'd say, "Yeah, well, I want my freedom." Are you for what we're doing? Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
Overwhelmingly, I don't know if there was one vote that said, no, don't continue. The people wanted to continue that boycott. They had been touched by the persecution, the humiliation that many of them had endured on buses. And they voted for it unanimously. And that meant thousands of people.
You see, when I first started fighting, I was fighting to keep so that the children who came behind me wouldn't suffer the same thing I suffered. Then the night of the bus boycott on December the 5th, I told the people that I had been fighting like that for all these years. I said, the night I changed my mind. I said, hell, I want to enjoy some of this stuff myself. And then y'all heard people hollering.
The keynote speaker at Holt Street Church was a new preacher in town, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was only 26 and was almost unknown outside his own congregation. King wasn't sure he should accept when his fellow ministers and other leaders asked him to head the new Montgomery Improvement Association and the boycott. But they wanted him in part because he was new in Montgomery.
Reverend King was a young man, very intelligent young man. He had not been young long enough for the city fathers to put their hand on him.
Martin said, well, I'm not sure I'm the best person for this position since I'm new in the community. And but if no one else is going to serve, someone has to do it, and I'd be glad to try to do it. And of course, I guess everybody then assured him they wanted him. So he came home very excited about the fact that he had to give the keynote speech that night at Mass meeting. He only had 20 minutes to prepare his speech.
We, the disinherited of this land, we who have been oppressed so long, are tired of going through the long night of captivity. And now we are reaching out for the daybreak of freedom and justice and equality. The only weapon that we have in our hands this evening is the weapon of protest. And certainly this is the glory of America with all of its faults. And we are not wrong. We are not wrong in what we are doing. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong.
We have never seen a crowd like that before. It took 15 minutes before people would sit down and become quiet and let us begin the meeting. And I will continue the name of the first song that we sang. It was What a Fellowship, What a Joy Divine, Leaning on the Everlasting Arms.
Before the boycott, 2/3 of the bus riders were black. After December 5th, there were almost no blacks at the segregated bus stops or on the buses. They walked, and they created a complex system that used private cars to carry thousands of people each day.
We asked for persons who had cars and would voluntarily put them in the transportation pool to let us know and what time they could be used. And in that way, we could know when we would have cars and where they had to go to pick up people. People would call in and say, I'm out here on Cloverdale Road and such a block, and I'll be ready at such and such a time. But this was being done all through the day, and we would know what time they was to go to be picked up and where they were.
It was really surprising because we thought, well, maybe some of the people would continue to ride the bus. But after all, they had been mistreated and been mistreated in so many different ways until I guess they were tired and they just decided that they just wouldn't run.
The black community was inspired by its own success. They held meetings with the mayor and the bus company and found they could stand up to the city commissioners.
At first, we didn't even ask for desegregation. We only asked for a more humane system of segregation on the buses. And when the opposition refused to grant that, then we realized that they wouldn't grant anything anyway, so we might as well ask for, complete desegregation. And that's what we went for, and we realized we had to go for broke, so to speak.
By this time, the boycott had lasted longer than anyone expected. A wave of violence started. Shots fired at buses. Bombs thrown at Martin King's home and E.D. Nixon's home.
You've had some rather personal and trying experiences yourself. Are you afraid?
No, I'm not. My attitude is that this is a great cause, it is a great issue that we are confronted with, and that the consequences for my personal life are not particularly important. It is a triumph of the cause that I'm concerned about. And I have always felt that ultimately along the way of life, an individual must stand up and be counted and be willing to face the consequences, whatever they are. And if he is filled with fear, he cannot do it.
We thought that you could just shame America. So now America, look at your promises. Look at how you're treating poor Negro citizens. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. But segregation, you can't shame segregation. You can't, rattlesnakes don't commit suicide. Multitudes don't strike themselves out. You got to put them out.
The nightly mass meetings in church were the backbone of the boycott.
The mass meetings usually were attended by the maids and cooks and janitors and people who really used the buses a lot, and they would be there singing and praying for hours sometimes before the program actually started, the main part of the mass meeting. You could go and you could learn about so many things that you didn't know exist, and so many people would tell you how they were being mistreated, and they were glad that they were able to come up and not have to take the same treatment that they once had taken and was afraid to admit.
The fear left, the fear that had shackled us across the years, all left suddenly when we were in that church together.
Dr. Abernathy would speak first usually, and he had the ability to really make them laugh and maybe make them cry some. He really knew how to, kind of get them in the mood.
This show is your show. The show of Negroes in Montgomery, but this is the show of Negroes all over America. And then I want to go a little further than that and tell you that truly this show is the show of all freedom-loving people all over the world.
What we should call it kind of folksy quality, and he was able to do that because that was a part of his style. Whereas with Martin, he was more, I guess, what you would consider formal, and he would come along with a very thoughtful message.
Let me urge you to be sane and rational. Eventually, segregation in public transportation will pass away. Eventually. And I think we should start now preparing for the inevitable. And let us, when that moment comes, go into the situations that we confront with a great deal of dignity, sanity, and reasonableness.
It's very hard for an ordinary person to describe Reverend King's speaking ability because he was such an outstanding man. He could make you feel what he was saying as well as hearing what he was saying. He was sincere and dedicated, and he could lift you out your seat. You couldn't just be quiet. Look like it was such a stirring thing that it would affect you. It just go right through you. So I can't say much more than that, because it's such a stimulating thing. And he was carried away, look like, with his own speech.
Dr. King spoke with a new voice. Not only was it a new movement, but it was a new voice. That you must love, you must not hate the people who hate or who act like they hate you. You must, and the best thing to make out of your enemy is a friend. So this had a very profound effect upon not only of blacks, but whites this time.
You are not going to permit the NAACP to control your state.
As the boycott entered its second month, the white community's position hardened. There were whites who were sympathetic to the boycott, but many more were not. A segregationist group called the White Citizens Council held huge rallies and vastly increased its membership, becoming the largest organization in white Montgomery. They targeted anyone, black or white, who supported desegregation.
90% of the white people in Alabama are for segregation, but in the last few years we have had quite a number of backsliders, you might say, that for political reasons, to further their political ambitions, have been trying to garner the Negro vote and would do most anything to get that vote. The Citizens Council is out to utterly destroy those people.
The thing that kept the whites going was segregation, was the old way. Don't break the old way. Don't break this fabric. Don't break down segregation. Don't take this away, this old South. Don't take back the things that we've always known, and that we fought a war over these things, and that our forefathers would have us do this.
Despite the pressure, the buses remained empty. The black leaders decided the boycott might weaken if they didn't respond quickly to the violence. They filed suit in federal court, claiming that bus segregation was unconstitutional. White officials retaliated by indicting almost 90 black leaders under an old anti-boycott law. The tactic backfired. Suddenly, the national press was very interested in the story, and in the eloquent Martin Luther King Jr.
We still feel that we are right and that we stand within our constitutional rights in the protest. We still advocate nonviolence, passive resistance, and still determined to use the weapon of love.
Jesus is with me. Oh, yeah.
Armed with the weapon of nonviolent resistance, Montgomery's blacks kept walking, month after month after month.
How many miles do you think you want?
Oh, about 7, 8 miles a day, maybe longer than that, because, you know, going and coming, it made a great deal distant.
ever tempted to take a ride from?
No. No, but if sometime we would be out on the road coming home, well, it'd be a white lady to come along and pick us up and carry us so far, and we would thank her for it. We would be very glad, and we would offer her pay, but she wouldn't take it.
But the strange thing that happened was a kind of a play between white women and black women. In the mayor of the town issued an order saying if the white women would just stop carrying the maids back and forth, that the boycott would be ended. And so, I don't say all of them, but some of them replied and said, well, if he wants to come out and do my cooking and laundry and nurse the children and clean up, he can. So the white women went and got them in the car. They said they did it because the bus had broken down. Any excuse you could possibly think of.
Well, I would have to say that there were many sympathetic whites who knew that the system was wrong and they were doing what they could to help to correct it.
Oh, you live with me. Oh, yeah. When I need a boy, you live with me. Oh, yeah. When I need a boy.
We, you know, a lot of times some of the young whites would come along and they would say, nigga, don't you know it's better to ride the bus than it is to walk? And we would say, no, cracker, no. We would.
April 1956. The boycott was 4 months old. In other states, lawsuits and black pressure were breaking down bus segregation, but not in Alabama.
We expect the city bus lines of Montgomery and the people of Montgomery to continue to obey all segregation laws as written. I have this day issued orders to the chief of police and the police department to continue to make arrests in all violations with reference to the segregation law.
Several southern cities, including Richmond, Virginia, Little Rock, Arkansas, Dallas, Texas, and others have ended segregation on city buses, and white and Negro passengers rode together on front seats without incident, mishaps or disturbances. The public officials of the city of Montgomery and the state of Alabama intend to obey the segregation laws of the city of Montgomery, and we, the Negro citizens of Montgomery, Alabama, do now and will continue to carry on our mass protest.
June 1956, 6 months. There had been boycotts before, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 3 years before, even in Montgomery itself, 50 years before. None had lasted so long with so much support. In Tallahassee, Florida, another boycott started. It was so effective that the bus company was forced to shut down operations. It was clear the boycotts hurt the bus companies, businesses, and the cities. It was not clear if they could end segregation. September 1956, 9 months. The Klan in Montgomery held a series of highly visible rallies.
They want to throw white children and colored children into the melting pot of integration, out of which will come a conglomerated, Mondo class of people. Both races will be destroyed in such a movement.
Many in the black community were frightened, but they kept walking. 10 months, 11 months. The boycott's second Christmas was approaching. Downtown stores were hurt, but neither the city nor the marchers would compromise. On November 13, 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court broke the deadlock, ruling unanimously that Montgomery's bus segregation was unconstitutional. That day, the Ku Klux Klan rode and walked the black neighborhoods again. This time, the blacks just watched, unmoved and unafraid.
The decision rendered by the Supreme Court yesterday was a victory. But it wasn't a victory for colored folks. Don't make that victory that small. It wasn't a victory for 50,000 Negroes in Montgomery. It wasn't merely a victory for 16 million Negroes of America. That was a victory for justice and goodwill.
Now, what would be our mode of action in the light of this decision? After thinking through this question very seriously, the Executive Board of the Montgomery Improvement Association recommends that the 11-month-old protest against the city buses will be called off, and that the Negro citizens of Montgomery, Alabama will return to the buses on a non-segregated basis. Are you ready for the question? All in favor, let it be known by standing on your feet. It seems that it is carried unanimously.
Because you get to understand that God is with you, that God can take care of you, that this is God's way, and you are there to do it. And I think that's a central drive. That's what many people don't understand about what happened back in the East Side. That here I am, that this is my duty. I've got to do something. And God is with me. And if God is with me, you know, how can you lose leaning on the everlasting arm?
Oh, what a beautiful city. Oh, what a beautiful city. Oh, what a beautiful city. Turn into the city. Hallelujah.
When the bus boycott was over, the blacks got on the bus to sit on the front seat just to show off. And they had a lot of fun sitting on the front seat riding to the college or riding away from the college. Nobody sat in the back then because all of them sat on the front. It was a jubilation. It was a joy.
Oh, 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 what a beautiful.
We had one self-respect. We had forced the white man to give what we knew was a part of our own citizenship, and so we had one back. And if you have never had the feeling to feel that this is not the other man's country and you are an alien in it, but that this is your country too, then you don't know what I'm talking about. But it is a hilarious feeling that just goes all over you, that makes you feel that America is a great country and we're going to do more to make it greater.
They forced the white man to do what he should have done, right? All right, so that was a look at Montgomery, the bus boycott. A couple of sort of comments. I wanted to be able to show some clips of what happens in Little Rock. We may start with that next time and then work our way through to at least the origins of the Vietnam War. But a couple of comments from the film. One, most importantly, what was the, how do I say this? What ultimately decided the outcome of this situation?
Supreme Court decision.
All right, it's the Supreme Court that gets involved, right? And what is the precedent that they use to overturn this form of segregation? Brown versus the Board of Education. That's why that decision was so important. So this was not that white people in Alabama suddenly decided to end segregation, they're going to be forced to end it, right? That's the role of the Supreme Court. It's the Supreme Court that's going to be the greatest ally of the civil rights movement and the African American community in general. The problem, of course, is going to be enforcement, right? That'll also be another major issue, is just because the Supreme Court declares something unconstitutional, that doesn't necessarily mean that white Southerners are going to go along with it, right? And that's what the incident in Little Rock is going to be about, where the federal government is going to actually have to call in the United States military to enforce federal law. So we'll take a look at that on Thursday, at least a little clip of it. Two other comments that we might make. The one guy, the white guy in the White Citizens Council, the state politician, saying, that there's been some backsliding here, that politicians are trying to garner the, quote, Negro vote. What might be a problem with that concept there? African Americans are not allowed to vote, right? Again, are very limited voting. Now they're legally allowed to in terms of the 15th Amendment, but there are all sorts of loopholes to make sure that they actually don't get the right to vote. So again, this was not an idea of trying to end segregation or challenge segregation to garner the Negro vote, because they themselves are not able to vote. And then one last little observation, that little interplay between the sort of the white, wealthy women and their maids, right? Notice that was kind of maybe slightly humorous, that they were going to get their maids and bring them back because they weren't riding the buses. And if the mayor wants to come clean our houses, he can do that, right? But just notice, once again, the sort of subtle message behind that is this hierarchy here in the South, right? White elites, and then there's poor blacks at the bottom here that are being, doing the menial labor within almost all of these communities, or all of these communities, right? Okay, that's a look, at least at the early civil rights movement. We got about 5 minutes here. I'm going to go ahead and let you guys go. And then next time we'll take a brief look at Little Rock and start looking at the Vietnam War and get back to the Cold War.